The next section in the content strategy guide is packaging. And they start off with going over some ways and some tips for creating effective titles and thumbnails. So fun fact for you, 90%, and this comes from YouTube, by the way, 90% of the best performing videos have custom thumbnails. Thumbnails and titles are incredibly important for driving views to your content. I mean, think about it. It's the first thing people see when they're scrolling through on YouTube looking for interesting content to watch. If you've got a super engaging, bright, energetic looking thumbnail and a title that's that's intriguing, you're going to be more likely to click on that video versus maybe another video that covers a similar topic that just doesn't look as interesting. So it's worth spending a lot of time working on your titles and thumbnails and testing with them and seeing what works best for you. But you want to make sure when you are putting your titles and thumbnails together that you want to be accurate. You don't want to misrepresent what's actually in the video, aka clickbait. You want to be concise. You want to stick with titles that are under 70 characters with most of the important keywords and ideas towards the front of the title. You do have 100 characters to work with in titles, but the shorter the better. You want to be searchable, meaning you want to use search-friendly keywords whenever possible, and you want to be engaging. So you want to use titles and thumbnails to create, as they say, an engaging tease of your video, and include your face as well when possible for kind of like a person, if you have a personality-rooted podcast, because people like to see who they're going to be watching. And also, finally, be consistent. So you want to be using the same titles across all of your platforms. This is going to help ensure that your viewers are watching the official podcast, but also to ensure that if they're consuming your content on a different platform, it will let viewers know that they are consuming the same episode, the same video, if the titles are consistent across all the platforms. Next, when it comes to building thumbnails, first of all, you want to avoid putting important elements in the bottom right-hand corner. If you look on YouTube and you see a thumbnail, in the bottom right-hand corner of the thumbnails is where the time code overlay is. So, and it's pretty small. It doesn't take up a ton of space, but you want to make sure that you're not putting important information in that section so that it gets covered up. Branding elements ideally should be put in the corners of the thumbnails. Again, of course, with the exception of the bottom right-hand corner. Again, you want to accurately represent the content. Like we mentioned earlier, don't put things in the thumbnail that are not going to be included in the final video. You also want to make it bright, make it high contrast, make it eye-catching, something that's going to catch someone's eye as they're scrolling through their feed on YouTube. And you want to make sure that all the different elements in the thumbnail are visible at any size. So if the thumbnail is being viewed on a big desktop screen, or whether it's viewed on a small, smartphone screen, you want to make sure that all text or all little graphical elements can be viewed no matter what the size of the thumbnail is. Next up, YouTube goes over some thumbnail and title tips for your full podcast episode. So starting with thumbnails, you want to make sure that you are sticking with a consistent theme and look. We kind of touched on this a little bit, but if if you're constantly changing up the design of your thumbnails, it could throw people off. People might, scroll past your video in their feed if the design doesn't look similar to how it's looked in the past. So just be careful. If you do want to change the design, be careful with how you do that. But ultimately, just stick with a consistent theme and look. You also want to include your episode number to quote unquote highlight newness, as YouTube says. And as we mentioned earlier, you want to include the host face to increase the effectiveness. Again, people like to see who they'll be watching when they are going to, when they're making the decision of what to watch on YouTube. It also helps as well, this wasn't in the guide, but it helps as well to have some expression in your face that's, maybe relevant to the video that you're publishing. Think about Mr. Beast. Now, Mr. Beast, this isn't a podcast related, but Mr. Beast always has some kind of, loud expression. That's a good thumbnail right there. Always has some big, energetic expression on his face. In basically every single thumbnail that he uses. And Mr. Beast knows a thing or two about YouTube, so maybe take a page out of his book when it comes to that. Also, when it comes to titles for full podcast episodes, It should include your podcast show title, episode number, and broad topic for the episode. Now, in my case, the Creative Control Room podcast is a long title that would take up an awful lot of space in an episode title for YouTube. So what I typically do is I will shrink it down to an acronym. I use a hashtag. So I use an acronym for the podcast along with the episode number. So if you take a look at the title of this episode on YouTube, it'll have the episode title, then a vertical line, and it'll have hashtag TCCRP108. I also include that hashtag within the descriptions. I include that hashtag within clips, and it kind of ties everything together. It seems to work for me. It's worked for me so far, so that's the route I go. You can take my recommendation or YouTube's there. I guess that's up to you. Some additional tips that YouTube provides when it comes to titles and thumbnails for full podcast episodes. Consider a recurring theme with your thumbnails and titles to make your podcast more readily recognizable. Again, we've kind of touched on that already. And then for audio only, let's say if your video podcast on YouTube is more or less just an audio only playback, there's really no video component, you want to consider ways to make it known to your audience that it's audio only. And that could include maybe putting audio only in the title. Maybe you could put a little speaker emoji in the thumbnail, but think of some different ways to make that known to your audience so they know what they're getting into. Now we'll move on to talk about podcast clip thumbnails and titles. For thumbnails, when it comes to podcast clips, you want to focus on a specific topic with a more generalized style compared to, say, the serialized nature of a full episode. Clips can typically, in a lot of cases, be more evergreen, so you're not doing clip episodes. You have your full episodes, and then you have clips from that episode. So you don't need to focus quite as much on the serialized nature of clips because they don't have one. And also feature your face in clips as well, if possible. Your titles should be engaging, but they shouldn't be clickbait. Again, accurately represent what's in the video. And then some additional tips there when it comes to clips. Treat your clip packaging more like any other upload. Those words, by the way, are directly from the YouTube guide. They don't really elaborate on what that means. And I'm a little bit confused by that phrasing as well. I'm going to have to assume that what they're saying there is to treat your clips as if you were the same way that you would treat a video that you were uploading to, say, a non-podcast YouTube channel, just like a regular video post, I guess. That's how I'm interpreting that. Next, consider how clips can meet the needs of your audience. Clips give viewers an opportunity to watch a section of your full podcast that might be more relevant to them. So some people might like to sit down and watch your full episodes, and then others might prefer to only watch a shorter clip that they are interested in. Clips give your viewers the opportunity to kind of have different ways to consume your content, so keep that in mind. Also, a side note when it comes to clip creation, I find that timestamps are very helpful when it comes to creating clips. So after you've created your timestamps, aka chapters, keep those in mind. So when it comes time to cutting up your full episode into its subsequent clips, you can refer to those timestamps and easily figure out kind of the start and end points of those clips. Next, you want to package clips with search and discovery in mind. Again, they don't really elaborate on this. I'm going to assume that they're suggesting that you use keyword-rich titles and descriptions, and you don't want to include clips in the same playlist as your full podcasts. That can just get a little confusing, kind of self-explanatory there, but don't put your clips in your full podcast playlists.